Hey everyone, and welcome to the Groundwork Podcast. I am your host, Kate Kavanaugh, and I have one of the most impactful episodes we have ever recorded today. I am so excited to bring you our guest, Bobby Gill, who is the Director of Development and Communications for the Savory Institute. This conversation is an exploration of a book that Bobby recommended to me. With the people that come on the podcast, I often ask them if there's a book that's made a particular impact on them or their work. And Bobby recommended The System's View of Life by Fridtjof Capra and Pierre Luigi Luisi. And it is the book I had been waiting my entire life to read. And so I devoured it. It's designed as a textbook, and I thought it was one of the most impactful things that I had ever read. And it really helped to give me language to explain what I have been experiencing as a farmer, as a nutrition therapist, as a butcher, and as somebody who is constantly seeking greater connection with my environment. And so I think that the contents of this episode are going to really plumb the depths of this exploration that this podcast is truly about, which is to find all the interconnected and juicy relationships between mind, body, and soil. I want to just briefly read this quote by Werner Heisenberg, who is the father of the uncertainty principle in physics. And he says, "The world thus appears as a complicated tissue of events in which connections of different kinds alternate or overlap or combine, and thereby determine the texture of the whole." When I explore this idea that we are a part of nature, that we are a part of our environment and not superimposed on it or separate from it, a lot of it is exploring all those different relationships that happen within that greater environment. This idea that there is some grand tapestry and each thread plays an integral role in how the rest of it connects. And I think that you're going to find a lot of that within this podcast. I do want to say that Bobby Gill is incredible, and his work with the Savory Institute is absolutely worth looking into. We don't get really deep into the Savory Institute in this podcast. We go a completely different direction. But I've provided some links in the show notes to podcast episodes and a TEDx talk where Bobby really talks about that work with Savory. And I just can't wait for you to get to know on a deeper level this incredibly beautiful and thoughtful and impactful human being. And I'm just so grateful to Bobby for really sharing his heart with me on this episode. I want to keep the intro really short because the podcast is quite long, but let me tell you that it is worth every minute. We go all sorts of places, and not one of them wasn't just profound and meaningful. If this podcast has the impact on you that it did on me as I recorded it, may I ask for you to please share it with any friends, any family members that might also enjoy it, post it to your social media. This really helps spread the word in an organic manner for the podcast. And as always, if you leave a written review on iTunes podcasts and send me a snapshot of it, I will send you in turn a handwritten note so that we can connect in real life. And it's part of a way of me giving back to my audience that is so important in keeping this podcast rolling and gaining momentum in the way that it is. And in honor of that, each week I read a little review from one of you, and this one perfectly aligns with the contents of this podcast. It's entitled Hidden Gem, and it's by Kurt. "I've been a conservationist going on 30 years now and have found what we all have in common is a deep connection with the things that surround us every day. My daughter, an artist, featured a traffic cone in her early artwork because she said no one values something as common as a traffic cone, but it actually has a tremendous function. Kate does an amazing job in making the traffic cones in our lives appreciated, whether it's living strenuously or thinking about something as common as wood. She really is a wonderful person with wonderful guests. Kurt, I can't thank you enough for that beautiful review. And I think that you will find that this podcast is all about unveiling the traffic cones in our lives. And so, without further ado, and thank you so much for listening, I have our incredible guest today, Bobby Gill. Thank you so much for doing this. I'm just so appreciative. Yeah. I really can't even begin to express my gratitude.
That means so much. I'm like, I don't think you know how excited I am for this conversation, because I don't know, I feel like given my work with Savory, the conversations are fairly similar, where it's let's talk grazing and soil health and regenerative ag and all of those things, incredibly important. And I'm deeply passionate about all of those things. But there's this other level of discussion and understanding of how the world works that I think is so, I don't know, transformational, pivotal. Like, I don't know, it brings so much clarity to everything. And I think you and I come from a similar background and perspective in terms of personal health. Like we lie at the intersection of health, personal health and planetary health, and look at those interconnected ecologies. And then there's this aspect of mental health and spirituality and just the interconnectedness of all things, and understanding that not just at A equals B and being able to memorize, what amino acids do, that sort of thing is important. But there's this deeper understanding of being and knowing that I think creates so much energy as it relates to the work that we're doing.
I do too. And I think it's that shift back from linear to nonlinear and is paradigm shifting in terms of how we understand how we fit into the world around us. I mean, literally just this morning, I saw this little cartoon and it was depicting a woman considering how she's not separate from the environment. Like, we use this word environment to mean something outside of us. And I want to come back to this idea that we are a part and connected into that space. And I think that you have so many of the puzzle pieces in that regard. And as
no, I don't. There are many. This is a very incomplete puzzle. The puzzle is never complete.
I love that.
I think that's important to acknowledge, is that the puzzle will never, ever be complete. But
and
you
that's
can
the beauty
try
of
to
the
understand
puzzle.
Different pieces. Yeah. It's you don't have to have the whole puzzle, but you can be like, oh, look, I snapped a few pieces into place. Oh, that's a flower. That's pretty beautiful, isn't that? You can understand some certain pieces without having the totality of it. And you don't need the totality of it to appreciate those smaller pieces and to understand what those are. It doesn't matter because there is no goal. There's no end point that we're going for in life. The ultimate end is, when we cease to be here and all that we are as carbon-based life forms gets composted back into the earth and turned into new life. And so, that's the fate that we all, end at. But what does it matter? That's not what we should be planning for. That's not what we should be focused on. It's focused on the here and now, and being able to fully express who we are as individuals and fully express our place in this world, as part of a larger integrated whole that is the living systems of life, and just doing the best we can with that and appreciating it for what it is.
And I think when you feel like you're a part, like you are a single thread in this greater tapestry of the whole, it begins to bring you into that present here and now, as opposed to this sort of, and I think this was actually one of the first things I wanted to talk about anyway, this break from cyclical thinking into a more linear, goal-oriented end product instead of process space.
Yeah.
And one of the things, and why don't we just dive in?
Because sure, why not? I mean, I assume we're already recording for the podcast.
We are.
We didn't get through
No.
introductions. You didn't like microphone test. What did you eat for breakfast? You know, that whole thing. It's just like, bam, let's
let's
go.
just dive right in. And I thought that we might do that, so I hit record, and I was like, man, we'll just dive right in and see what happens. And I kind of like dropping into podcasts in the middle of a conversation, because I think you and I have been having this conversation through this beautiful book that you gifted me. You gave me the book I've literally been waiting my whole life to read. And I can't even tell you what it meant to me. It brought together all of these different concepts that I had been trying to give language to, and it gave me more language, and it gave me more connection. And so you gave me the most beautiful gift that I can even begin to explain. So
that's wonderful. That book has meant just as much to me as well. I think I came across it maybe 2 years ago. And so, my work is deep in holism and understanding the interconnectedness of life. That's what we do at the Savory Institute, is we teach, people how to make decisions in a holistic manner. Like, that's the core of what we do. And we do it for farmers and ranchers and pastoralists. But when I came across Fritjof Capra's The Systems View of Life, which I have my copy of right here, just if anyone wants to see what the cover looks like. It's pretty much a textbook. It's intended to be like an undergraduate level textbook, but it is a grand synthesis of Fritjof Capra's life's work, which started as a physicist and then led him to living systems. And for me, my background is I'm trained as a biomedical engineer. That's what I did for the first chapter of my life. Is I went to school to become a biomedical engineer. I worked as a biomedical engineer. I worked for the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. So I was, a government employee who was regulating cardiovascular devices, really in that mechanical mindset of the biomedical view of biology. How can we break down the human body into its individual parts? And let's look at those isolated parts and let's optimize those. Let's fix those. Let's understand those to the fullest extent.
And understand them.
We can do that.
Yeah. And understand them through the lens of this idea that we are a machine, that we really can be broken down into these parts, and not this idea that the sum of the parts, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts.
Exactly. Yeah. It's just looking at the parts and saying, all you need to do is look at those individual parts, and that's all you need to know. And so it's looking at the human body as a machine. And that similar way of viewing the world, I think, is how we look at agriculture and ecology and conservation and so many other aspects. We look at it as a machine. How can we break this down into individual parts? How can we reduce the complexity of it into something that the human brain can understand? We're like, oh, okay, well, this does this, and then that does that. And then so if we change this for that, then it equates to this. You can use logic and algorithms and equations to understand the function of things. And that works really well when it comes to mechanical things. That works really well if you're taking apart a computer or a bicycle or a rocket ship or a car or whatever it is. You can break it down to the individual parts, and you say, okay, well, the tensile strength is this, and so that means that we are capable of doing this. And then when it reaches this point, this will break, but we can replace that if it breaks. There's this way of thinking, and it's done amazing things for us. The human species is a tool using species. And so we are reliant on this mechanical way of thinking because it's allowed us to use tools, which has allowed us to hunt, and it has allowed for our survivability and evolution over millennia. And it's been incredibly powerful for us. But I think the problem we run into is when we take that mechanical way of thinking for tool making, which has now advanced towards, really complicated things like computers and things of that nature. And we equate that same line of thinking to living systems. So
Yes.
we've taken how we view machines and we've applied that towards living systems. And there's a very big difference between machines, which are complicated in nature. Complicated, you can fully understand every individual piece of the puzzle. You can dissect it. You can replace things when they break. And it does what you tell it to do with full predictability. And that predictability, I think, is the key piece there. That's complicated. And there's a difference between complicated machines and complex adaptive living systems. So complicated and complex. Complexity is infinite. Complexity, you will never understand the totality of it all. And if you try to understand all of it, or you try to reduce the infinite complexity into individual parts, say, I have a farm or a ranch and I am going to optimize, my beef production, the dollar per pound that I am able to fetch, at auction, that's what I'm going to optimize. If you reduce everything down to an individual KPI, you are going to have unintended consequences because you are bypassing and you are overlooking the totality of the whole in which that piece that you are managing exists. And so you need to acknowledge the infinite complexity and the unpredictability of living systems. Because when you have a farm or a ranch or an organization or a family or a society or an economy, these are all complex adaptive living systems that are comprised of organisms, of humans, of animals, of species. And we all have agency and soil and microbes. Yeah. And we make decisions. We do things out of urges. Sometimes we do things at random. Sometimes properties emerge out of a living system where you're like, that grass grew right there and I wasn't expecting that. Or, wow, look at the way that this swarm of birds just came in and ate all of that stuff, like totally unpredictable. And so when you are trying to apply the mechanical way of thinking of absolute control and predictability to something that is ultimately unpredictable and infinitely complex, that has emergent properties that cannot be predicted, you can't ultimately control that system. The best you can do is exist within it and have this cooperative dance with it, this back and forth of understanding of like, I'd like to move things in this direction and I can influence the system, but I can't fully control what happens. So like, I'm going to influence the system. I'm going to move my herd of animals onto this pasture for this period of time. And what I think is going to happen is I'm going to create this type of animal impact. And as time goes on, the grasses will regrow and that will happen. Oh, shoot. Well, there was a drought and we got hit with this, whatever. There's the unpredictability of weather and climate and, just nature. And you can't predict those things. So how do you adapt to that? And that's ultimately what this systems thinking perspective is it is saying, how do we understand the interconnectedness of all that is life, whether that be farming, ranching, human health, mental health, how societies work, how an organization operates, and you manage people within that. And, rather than trying to control these complex adaptive living systems, let's shift our thinking to more of that cooperative dance and feedback loops that are important to know, okay, I tried something, did it work? No. Okay, let's try it again. And let's move in an iterative fashion towards the direction that we want to be heading, recognizing that there is no ultimate goal, but we can exist within a context of saying like, this is my guiding North Star. This is the direction I want to be moving in with my life, with my business, with my family, whatever it may be. How do I make decisions that are going to move in that direction, recognizing that there will be unpredictability and I won't be able to fully reach some sort of endpoint, but I can at least exist along that path and do my best.
I think there's this aspect of it's the interconnected relationship between things and really recognizing that those relationships are what build the foundation for what happens within that system. And I pulled a quote from Capra that according
Hmm.
to the system's view, the essential properties of an organism or living system are properties of the whole, which none of the parts have. They arise from the interactions and relationship between the parts. These properties are destroyed when the system is dissected, either physically or theoretically, into isolated elements. Although we can discern individual parts in any system, these parts are not isolated, and the nature of the whole is always different from the mere sum of its parts.
Mm.
And I
Yeah.
and I'm curious, I want to rewind just a touch, and I want to talk about when we break from, because I think naturally humans have an element of systems thinking. We're out there,
Hmm.
we're within the context of an ecosystem, we're hunting and gathering and foraging for millennia. And so we understand our role in the environment. We have that, what you and what Capra calls this ecological literacy. And
Hmm.
I think with the dawn of agriculture, there begins to be this little break, this little sectioning off. And I think that break with nature and beginning to view ourselves as separate, I think Charles Eisenstein would call this the myth of separation.
Hmm. Yep.
And then that gets furthered around the time of Rene Descartes, where we get into this very mechanistic, very reductionist view of thinking, and the mathematics of the time are really mirroring that. You have
Hmm.
Newton that's really reducing everything down into exactly how it moves, but taking it out of that context of a system. And I pulled this quote from Werner Heisenberg, who Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, for those that know about that this partition has penetrated deeply into the human mind during the 3 centuries following Descartes, and it will take a long time for it to be replaced by a really different attitude toward the problem of reality. But I think that we naturally want to view things in a cyclical rather than linear nature, because that's what's mirrored to us in nature. Nature is cyclical through seasons, through life and death. And so I just wanted to unpack with you where this break, or where these breaks begin to occur.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's an aspect of, yes, we as humans are or can be, more holistic in terms of understanding and embodying a systems view of life, in terms of what our role is in terms of this larger natural world that we exist in. I think we best embody that when we are in relationship to the world around us, and that includes to the natural environment in terms of our communities, the people around us, and in terms of our relationship to ourselves. So I think when we are in proper relationship, we can better embody that role that we have evolved, that ecological niche that we fill as part of this greater whole that is the living and breathing world around us, because humans are one piece of it, as you've mentioned. And you mentioned Rene Descartes, whose Cartesian worldview, his whole thing was that separation of mind and matter, that mind is this thinking, this soul, this piece, and then matter is like your brain, your body, and all of that, and those are two separate things. And that is speaking towards that mechanical view of the living world, when in actuality the mind is a process. It's a relationship. It's consciousness. It's how we understand our place in the world. And, that consciousness, isn't an isolated thing that can be analyzed in a certain way and broken down and understood. It is the essence of who we are. It is an emergent outcome of the complexity of the human body and all the interconnected parts. I mean, you could go and grow all the different organs and skin and bones and all of that in a lab and try to assemble them together, but you're not going to create a human. Like, there is an essence of life there that cannot be manufactured. And, I think acknowledging that is important. But to get back to the piece you were saying of when do we, when did that bifurcation happen, of when did we split away from this, kind of holistic embodiment of our role in the natural world. I think that, as you mentioned, the dawn of agriculture, some 10,000 years ago, is probably a piece there. But I would factor to say that we haven't totally lost it. I think we've more forgotten it. I think it is within us. And I think you can see it at times when people are in proper relationship, as I said, with their environment, with their communities, and with themselves. And I think what that looks like is true expression of the whole, of who are you as a whole being. And that is being true to yourself with your intellectual curiosity and with what you want to do in life, and being able to express your thoughts and feelings and art and, whatever it may be. And it's not necessarily a mastery of facts and statistics and knowledge. I think that there's a difference there. Being a biomedical engineer by training, I'm very logic driven, left brain oriented, and that has served me incredibly well in life. And I very much appreciate that side of me. But only in the past few years have I really been able to lean into that other piece of me that is, more creative, just acknowledging the wonder and awe of everything that is life, and not needing to understand it all, and not needing to have a rationale for why it exists or how it exists, just sitting back and being with it. And I think that aspect of being, like being with yourself and being with your environment, that right there is the embodiment of holism and our role in the natural world. Because you go back to hunter-gatherer times, and, they weren't sitting around saying like, okay, well, what's the velocity of the spear throw? And if I do that, can I do this? And like, they're not sitting there like doing math. And, eventually we got to that. And, I'm sure we could dive into, the Greeks and Aristotle and, kind of academia and where all of that arose, and, this classic, form of, modern day thought and how all of that arose. But ultimately, we used to exist in the natural world as hunter-gatherers, on the savannas of Africa, and, just witnessing what was around us and being in tune with those cycles of nature, kind of understanding when the sun rises and when it sets, or how the seasons come and go, or watching how different animals interact with one another or migrate across the landscapes. We were deeply in tune with those rhythms of the natural world. And we had to for our survival. And so there's something that's deep within our DNA and our evolution that connects with the natural world and understands those rhythms of the natural world. And when we can connect in with that, like I know you do a lot of work in terms of your circadian rhythms and what time you get up and all of those sort of things. When we're able to lean in to those rhythms of the natural world, we more fully embody the whole that is ourselves. And when we show up as a whole person, we can better serve the community and the environment around us. And if everyone were to better show up for themselves, they would be able to better serve all of those around them. And that requires just that release of needing to know everything and needing to have an answer and logic to every piece, and trying to tune in more to who am I? How can I more fully express who I am as a person? And that's going to look different for every single person. And there's no right answer to it, but it's a being able to pause and listen and reflect and just be with life and yourself and go with the flow of that. It's that cooperative dance.
I don't think I could have said that better. And I think, As I was listening to you speak, you said we can't grow a human in a lab, right? Like we can't take these isolated parts and put them together and find what it is that makes us human. And I think a big part of what makes us human is what we are in relationship to our environment, which is a conversation that is constantly evolving and changing. And
Mm-hmm.
and not just our environment, but also within our communities and in relationship to one another. That we can't just exist as this self-isolated ego inside a meat suit. That it is that it is our constant reaching out and shifting and adapting and evolving with environmental pressures that are really changing us. And I want to add to this, something that I've been doing a lot lately is this kind of idea of feminine and masculine embodiment work, and what you were speaking to. And we all have this, right? This isn't a gendered thing. We all have
Of course.
aspects of the feminine and the masculine, but this really masculine logic, solution, structure oriented viewpoint versus this more feminine idea of being in flow and being in connection. And there's another really great book called The Fourth Turning that really explores how time operates on these cycles. And I'll link to that in show notes. And they talk about when we make this jump from cyclical to linear time in the Renaissance, like we kind of make this shift from cyclical, we also make a shift from feminine, which is really represented by the number 4, these sort of equal seasons or the phases of the moon, or where all of that is, into the shift into the masculine, into the linear, into the number 3, which naturally lends itself to this idea of something is going to be superimposed on the other 2 things. And it's a really interesting space. And I think that we've done that. We've flattened, we've made linear the natural cycles that we are constantly experiencing, whether that is the seasons. We've created perpetual summer with air condition, with heating. We've created perpetual seasons of eating with refrigeration. We've created this with the agricultural cycle and, with the rest recovery cycle. Like all of these things we have turned into linear processes when they really are cyclical and sort of have this concept of the feminine. And I think I'm seeing this return in the way that people speak that represents this just wanting to be, and to be in concert and in co-creation with the rest of the environment.
Yeah, I think there's a deep desire for it, especially when you look at the state of the world that we're in. I mean, there is a lot of trauma happening at the global scale, just in every form, wherever you look, whether it's the climate crisis or food sovereignty or water or wildlife or politics or just safety in schools. Like there is just trauma, the world over. And when you look at that, you go, wow, why is there so much happening all at once right now? You can kind of go back to like, well, we're not in relationship with who we are as humans. Like we live in this ultra connected digital age where we have access to more information than we've ever had in our entire lives. But that information isn't making us better. It is, when you take that, one aspect of systems thinking is looking at how feedback loops exist, whether they amplify or dampen a certain signal that is going through that system. And so in the example of social media is built upon the advertising model. And so the algorithm, it knows to optimize engagement. It wants people to click and like and comment, and it wants people to click on ads because that's what gives it life. So the feedback loop there is whatever gets more clicks, whatever gets more engagement, regardless of the quality of the engagement, gets amplified, and you get more of that. And so that's how people go down conspiracy theory rabbit holes. That's how misinformation spreads, because misinformation spreads faster than truth on social media. That's been proven over and over again. And so the way that the system operates, it has a feedback loop that amplifies something that we actually don't want. It encourages negative behavior. It encourages damaging behavior to the system because that's what it rewards and incentivizes and feeds back into the system. And so if you look at that and say, okay, the information systems that exist within the world are not serving us, how could we create a more optimized feedback loop there? Okay, well, what if we encouraged cooperation somehow? Or what if we just got rid of the advertising model that was the basis of many of our digital technologies? What if there was another model that is yet to be conceived that powered those systems? That would probably better serve who we are as a society and reduce the divisiveness and tribalism that is becoming so rampant everywhere you look around the globe. It's not just a problem here in the United States. It is global that you see. And so that's, kind of one way of taking the systems view to not just understand something, from like an intellectual perspective, but to apply that towards the present day and say, how can I use this perspective of the whole and the interconnectedness and the feedback loops and use that to improve and to get a better outcome for what we want in this system. I forget what your initial question was that led me down this path.
I love that.
It's something that I think, you can take that same line of thinking and apply it, whether you're talking social media, or I always go back to farming and ranching because that's, my day-to-day.
That's our job.
As is yours. Yeah. And, of many people's, should be more people's.
Yes.
But, that way of thinking, I think, is a way of not just, theory, but turning it into practice, a way that you can look at these things.
I think too, and I haven't fully thought this through, it was just as you were speaking that this kind of came to me, that there is some knowledge of systems thinking on the other side of that algorithm that's manipulating things towards this more divisive nature. And I think that this is one of the most pernicious things in our society right now is how divisive, how unable we are to come to the table and have civil discourse in order to talk about all ideas, good and bad, and to really flesh that out and to have a sense of building something together. And I think that within that system, those systems that are creating those algorithms, they understand that you exist within this larger context of all of the evolutionary pressures that have shaped your mental biology, the way that your neurotransmitters work. They are preying on the fact that we really are just sort of these ancient minds in a modern world, right? I mean, modern human sapien at about 200,000 years old, and really only having this technology for the last, 50 years is maybe being generous. And our ancient hardware has not caught up. And that dopamine response, for example, is still built out of when we're out hunting and gathering and we see a bush with these beautiful red sugary berries all of a sudden, and dopamine surges as a mechanism to help us remember where that berry bush is, what season it's in, because it's providing us with this critically important nutrient, this sugar, before winter so that we can begin to store fat. And so it has this really specific and necessary mechanism. But when you put that into a digital age of social media, you can exploit that. And it is reflective of how we interact with our environment. And so in a way, I guess what I'm thinking about is I think that the tech overlords that exist, I guess we'll call them, have this knowledge of how you exist in relationship to a system and how you were shaped by your environment. And I think in turn, this is changing how the human brain is shaped by its digital environment.
There's an aspect there. You mentioned the term overlords, which I think is hilarious. But I think when people think of a lot of the problems that are happening globally, it's convenient for us. We always want to have an actor who is the bad guy. And we always want to think that there's some room of evil henchmen that are scheming to destroy the world. And perhaps some of those people exist in some way, shape, or form. But, I prescribe more to the worldview that it is more a disconnection from reality. I don't believe that Mark Zuckerberg is sitting there saying, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to design an algorithm that's going to exploit people and it's going to manipulate them to do X, Y, and Z. I think he has decided that engagement is important, that connection to people is the only thing that matters. So he has reduced the totality of human connection and cooperation and relationship to the metrics of how many times does your communication touch another person. Like, he has reduced the complexity of that to a single metric and has optimized for that single metric with a feedback loop of monetary reward in terms of advertising. And so the system has been designed in a way that has taken complexity and has reduced it down into a single or a few metrics that are being optimized. And when you are optimizing a few components, a few pieces of a complex system at the expense of other pieces, you create this large imbalance, because a healthy ecosystem is one that's in dynamic equilibrium. It's when everything is in proper relationship, information and nutrients and energy and water is all flowing evenly throughout this cooperative dance of life. But when you start ignoring some of those pieces and just try to maximize this one corner of the system over here because you've decided that's what matters because of your position in life and the power you have, or human hubris, whatever it may be, what you're doing is you are growing one piece of this system and it's creating a disequilibrium that throws off that dynamic balance of the living system that you're operating within. And that's where these, negative feedback loops start coming into, well, not negative feedback loops, because negative is a dampening feedback loop, but an undesirable feedback loop really starts to get amplified.
I wonder if you could almost, I completely agree with everything that you said. And I think it is this focusing on just the metric, this quantitative metric of how much money, how much, connection does this generate? And then you would view some of the negative implications of that as almost an emergent property of that system, an unintended consequence.
Those unintended consequences, those externalities that rear their heads and cause problems, those are known as wicked problems. And so wicked problems are, climate change is a wicked problem. It is something that no one intended to happen. A room full of evil henchmen didn't plan it out, but we have been living within a complex, adaptive living world and treating it as if it's a machine. And we have ignored the fundamental properties and relationships of our existence in that world. And as we've put those aside, it has created these negative consequences, which are known as wicked problems. They emerge seemingly out of nowhere. They build upon themselves. What starts as something small then amplifies and just gets worse and worse. And then as humans, still in that logical, mechanical way of thinking, we start playing the game of whack-a-mole, where we're like, oh, well, then this problem perked up. Well, okay, well, you've got this. Well, then take this pill to solve that problem. And oh, well, there's an unintended consequence of that pill. Well, then take that pill for this. But then that creates this. So then take that pill. And you end up playing this game of whack-a-mole, whether that's on your ranch or, you know, for your own personal health or for society at large. And ultimately what we're doing is we're putting Band-Aids over bullet holes.
Yes.
We're addressing symptoms and not addressing root causes of problems. And so that's another aspect that I think is, taking the theory of systems thinking, of holism, of interconnectedness, and taking that to practice is, rather than trying to address every undesirable symptom that arises, taking a step back, looking at the totality of what it is you are managing, what is the whole that you have influence over, and trying to identify what are the root causes of the problems, because maybe you're not making as much money as you need to on your ranch. And so you're saying, I need to make more money. Okay, well, so I'll just start bringing in feed. You know, I'll bring in some corn. I'm gonna feed it to my animals. That'll fatten them up. I'll be able to make more money on it that way. But that doesn't really solve the issue of why you're not making money. It could be that you have really expensive equipment that, you know, you've got leases on that, you know, you're leveraged to the max, and that's not really a good position to be in. And maybe you could sell some of that equipment because you don't need to be doing this portion of your business, and instead you could move to a fully grass-based operation where the energy into it is free because it comes from the sun. And if you were to plan your grazing in a way that optimizes the forage production, that's a free resource that you should capitalize on. And so how can you reduce the cost of your inputs and be more intentional on what you're doing to address the root cause of, you know, the profitability that is the current factor that you're worried about? Or as an individual, you are, I'm trying to think of an example of, you know, human health, where, you know, you are experiencing, you know, gut problems, and you're saying, okay, well, I'm experiencing all these gut problems. The doc says, here, take this medicine. This will help, you know, address your SIBO or like whatever it is.
Yes.
And really it's because you're overstressed, because you're overworked. You've got too much stressors in life, and that's causing a cascade of things to happen within you. And so in that situation, it's really some stress management that's needed. And maybe you need to get into meditation or slow down and do some gratitude journaling or whatever it may be. You need to offload some projects at work, and that's ultimately going to resolve the health issues that you're facing. And so that shift from how can we play whack-a-mole with all the symptoms to how do we take a step back and try to identify root causes and address those goes a long way.
This is one of my biggest refrains, is that I think we should be looking for root causes. And I think also that it's so important that that is plural. So often we're looking for the singular root cause, but in a complex system, we're not always going to find this single point where something has started to shift in the way that it might work optimally. And so you've really hit on something that I'm just incredibly passionate about. And it leads me, you know, one of my questions for you is, how do we begin to adopt this idea of systems thinking when it is so distant from the current paradigm of thinking? And I've heard you refer to this, and Capra too, as a sense of ecological literacy, that when we really place ourselves within the environment, we better understand those systems because we're a part of them. I mean, and then that's part of how we view and see the world. And so how do we bring people, both, and I think my question is, both adults that are already maybe on a more linear sort of quantitative over qualitative, measuring over mapping viewpoint. But also, I know that you are a fairly new, not that new anymore, father. And so how do we engender this sense of connection and systems thinking in the next generation?
Well, you brought up ecological literacy, which I think is core to it all. Current society is the most ecologically illiterate society that has ever existed on this planet. We are the most removed from the natural world that we have ever been. We are disconnected from our food systems. We are disconnected from understanding the local flora and fauna of our environment. We are disconnected, as you said, from the seasons, and we live in a state of perpetual air conditioning and heating and, artificial lights and all of these things, which I'm not perfect, of course. I'm relishing in the cooling that I have in my house right now.
Absolutely.
It's going to be like close to 100 degrees.
I'm sweating
today.
in the cooling I don't have in my house right now. And I'm looking at blue
and that's
light.
that's not to say we need to have this romantic notion of the past, that we need to romanticize hunter-gatherers and say, let's throw away technology and let's become Luddites and let's, just wear our, loincloths and walk around barefoot. And, and for some people, maybe that's your thing. Go for it. But the reality is we exist in the year 2022 right now. And, there is technology that we are using right now, and there are needs that we have, and we can't just entirely divorce ourselves from it.
And I think we can integrate that technology can become a healthy part of this system. I think that we are at such a young, we are infants with technology, and what is to come in the next hundreds and thousands of years, we will look back on this time and maybe laugh at ourselves in terms of the relationship that we have with technology. And so I think that
life has been on this planet for 3.6 billion years. Human beings for about 2 million years, hominids for 2 million years. 200,000 years has been human evolution. We've had agriculture for about 10,000 years. And then we've had the internet for 30.
Yeah. So, and I think, have you ever seen that there's a beautiful graph that represents this as a 24-hour clock, and humans show up, and I'm not 100% on this. Humans show up just a couple of minutes to midnight within the clock of the earth. And so this is all just so new.
And recorded human history, from 5,000 BC onwards is the last second.
Yes.
Or, pretty much. It's when you realize the immensity of life that has ever existed and will ever exist, and then you think about not just the immensity of time, but also the immensity of size of the universe that we live in, and acknowledge that the universe is expanding at an immense rate, you realize, wow, there's something powerful there when you sit with it. But to go back to your question of how do we integrate this way of viewing the world and acknowledging our interconnectedness as humans within the natural world, not as separate from it, but as an integral part of it. I think that ecological literacy is a component. I think we need to reconnect with the natural world and also do a reconnection to our community and to ourselves. And, that is personal work for all of us to do. And so I think reestablishing those relationships is step one for sure. But in practical terms, I think there are some things that can be done. And I know that I'm biased because I work for the Savory Institute, and this is what we teach. I think most people, when they hear the term, or, they hear of the Savory Institute and Alan Savory, they think of holistic planned grazing. This is, a planning procedure for planning the grazing of herbivores across a grassland ecosystem, whether that's farming, ranching, pastoralists. We can teach people how to move animals across a landscape to get the optimal outcome on that land. But that's one component of a larger umbrella that is holistic management. And holistic management is a decision-making framework for managing complexity. And so while there is a planning procedure for grazing, there's also a land planning piece and a financial planning piece and a biological monitoring piece. Those are all the individual components that exist within the larger umbrella of holistic management, which is a framework that basically says, okay, identify the whole that you exist in. So Bobby, let's use an example. Let's say I manage a ranch. Okay, I manage a ranch. Who does that affect? Who is involved? Well, there's some ranch hands that do X, Y, and Z. The landlord is this person. This person has veto power whenever I make decisions because this is their role within this. and let's get everyone at the table and say, all right, what is it that you want in life? What do you want this landscape to look like 200-300 years into the future? So it's not something that you will see yourself, but what do you want out of this? And not just what do you want the landscape and the environment to look like, what do you want your quality of life to look like? So let's not just focus on the ecological piece. Let's focus on the social component. What's your quality of life? And embedded with that is a financial aspect, because, inevitably I want to have a profitable ranch that I'm economically comfortable, financially savvy and all that sort of stuff. So it's trying to broaden the perspective from one individual component. How can I make the most money possible? And it's taking more of a triple bottom line approach of how can I look at the ecological, the social, and the financial. And let's define those far out into the future. And then now you have that defined, you say, there's then a framework for decision making that says, okay, you use this. We call that what I just described. That's your holistic context. That then becomes your North Star. That is your guiding light for all decisions, any tough decision that you come across. Like, hey, we're facing a drought. Do we destock our herd or do we bring in outside feed? What's the right answer here? Well, your gut reaction might be to do this, but if you take a step back and you look at the whole, you'd realize, well, if we brought in feed, that would get us to survive through to the spring. But, ultimately, ecologically, it's not doing what we need for the environment because blah, blah, blah. There are ways to assess all of that. And so it's forcing you to take a step back and say, is the decision I'm making going to lead in the direction that ultimately I want to go? And so it creates that feedback loop of, is this decision moving in the direction? Because as humans, we are really good at chasing the shiny thing and, shooting from the hip and being like, well, we've always done it this way. And well, I think we should do it this way. And so you do it without really giving it some thought. And so this is a framework that forces you to take a step back, consider the whole that you are managing and how it affects everyone involved from a variety of perspectives. And let's make decisions that try to get you as close as possible to the direction you want to go in. And there's a series of checks. There's 8 questions that you run through whenever we call them the context checks. The first one being, does this address the root cause of the problem? So like, does it address the root cause? Does this create the greatest marginal reaction? You look at gross profitability, you look at the sustainability of your decision, and then, you go through all of these. And ultimately the 8th question is, what's your gut feel about it? So it's approaching a decision from a bunch of different perspectives to force to kind of override our human nature that is to be impulsive and, to follow our gut. And I think because human nature is so well trained in this mechanical way of thinking, it's a framework to force you to be more holistic in how you make decisions. And, I can speak for the tens of thousands of people across the world that we've trained who are managing their land and livestock and families and organizations this way. Like it really changes how you see the world and forces you to embrace the interconnectedness of the individual pieces, because you'll say, well, yeah, I want to do this thing, but ultimately I know that there's going to be this repercussion. You get better and better as time goes on at seeing the world through that holistic lens. And then those 8 questions that you run through, the context checks, they become second nature that you just like automatically quickly run through in the back of your head. Whenever you're faced with a decision, you're, oh, that's not going to be a root cause. So like, no, let's get creative and find a new way of doing things. So ultimately, to put a bow on this, Q&A section, the way that I would say we embody this holistic, more integrated living systems view of life is to be intentional on how we make decisions and try to adopt a more holistic approach. Whether you use the specific holistic management framework that we teach at the Savory Institute, that's great. or whether you have another way of embodying that interconnectedness and holism. Do it in whatever way makes the most sense to you, but try to find a way to be more intentional and holistic in how we make decisions, because the way we make decisions is ultimately informed by our worldview. And if we're viewing the world as a machine, we're going to be, reducing the complexity of that down to individual components and trying to optimize individual pieces, whether that is, I want to optimize my beef production, I want to optimize the money in my bank account, I want to optimize my happiness, I want to optimize, how much weight I can lift. We make all of these decisions, and we might be making these decisions at the expense of others. So, try to take a step back and see the greater whole.
This is such a beautiful framework. And I know that I've talked a lot on this podcast about developing a set of values and how important that's been for the way that I guide and lead in my own life. But this really takes it a step further into considering how those values interact with all of these different pieces of your life and create a sense of long-term thinking, which I think is sorely lacking.
Yeah.
That we are considering generations ahead of us, that we are considering what the environment looks like ahead of us. And to pull another quote from Capra, I pulled this idea that, quote, a sustainable society is one that satisfies its needs without jeopardizing the prospects of future generations. And so I think it's also incorporating something that is really vital and looking at it as a whole. And it is a paradigm shift, I think, when you begin to use this as a lens through which you view the world. And it does take, like you said, practice before it becomes something that is a little bit more reflexive, a little bit more ingrained. But within that, I also want to ask you, how do we shift this view and then impart that onto our children? Because I think that the next generation has a very different opportunity to begin to see this in childhood and to have that be the operating system that they are then growing up with and going out into the world with.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I don't think there's an easy answer to it. I think we can try our best to embody it ourselves and use that as an example that we can then show for others and hope that that resonates with them, that our embodiment of holism allows them to see that, to feel that, and want to embody that for themselves. And so I think that's probably the most important thing we can do. But there are probably aspects of, so my daughter, she's 19 months, so she's a year and a half. And, I try to be very intentional of, if she is expressing something, like she doesn't have a lot of language yet, she's got a little bit, but not a lot. But when she's expressing something, she's got a strong feeling or a desire or whatever it is. I think our default at times is like, that is an inconvenience to me because I'm trying to cook dinner and you're saying, I want to be held. And like, that's inconvenient for me because it takes me off the path that I was intending to be on. And rather than trying to suppress that and shut that down, let me suppress the expression of who you are as a whole person. Like, give that the attention it deserves. Like, allow her the space to express whatever she is feeling and acknowledge it, see it, try to understand where it's coming from. And, oftentimes I find that when she's, being, loud and obnoxious or whatever it may be, if I try to resist it, it makes it worse. If I put aside what I'm doing for a second and I just am fully present with her and I'm like, you have my attention, let me absorb what it is you're trying to give to me. Normally that's all she needs. It's like recognition and like acknowledgement of what it is, of what she is feeling. And that's all she needs. She's just looking for relationship. She's looking for connection. She's like, I'm trying to express this. I connected with Dad. I expressed it. Okay, that's all I needed. now I'm going to go back and I'm going to doodle on this thing. Like, and that's all that's needed at times. And so I think there's an aspect of practicing the acknowledgement of the whole person so that she is, as she grows up to be, as she grows up, she is better versed in expressing herself and knowing who she is as a person, and hopefully having that connection to the natural world, spending time outside, cooking with mom and dad so that she understands the importance of food, because food is such an important aspect of who we are as people, and growing food and visiting farms and playing outside and, understanding the cycles and the rhythms of nature, not because I've taught them to her, but because she has experienced them, because she has existed within them. And I think that's the best we can do, is try to just address those underlying conditions, try to create the conditions that hopefully the emergent properties that you want to see, hopefully they will emerge if you've done things the right way and if you've addressed those underlying conditions. It's like, if you want to have a really healthy landscape or farm or a ranch, you can't just say, I'm going to optimize my carbon, because that might lead you to develop some climate sequestration factory that, pumps CO2 out of the atmosphere and stores it underground, rather than saying, okay, how can I create a diversity of life such that the plants and the animals and the microbes and the fungi and everything is all in symbiotic relationship and feeding into one another and creating this state of abundance. Let me create those conditions by ensuring that I've got a biodiversity of plant species, that my water is cycling properly through my soils. How do I ensure that nutrients, from cattle manure is properly cycling through? How do I ensure that there's a good biodiversity of plants and animals, and not just a diversity, but a succession in terms of ages, so that you've got that deep complexity and richness in your system. And then if you have all of those things, regeneration and abundance should be an outcome that just emerges from that system. And so I think, as it relates to how do you apply this to the younger generation, connect them to nature, let them embody who they are, address all those underlying conditions, and hopefully, good, healthy, whole, integrated whole of a person will emerge out of that in life.
I have you just touch base on two questions I have about carbon as the single metric and nutrient cycling. But before I go there, I want to just tease out one more question in this path, because you said this piece with our children, we should be practicing the acknowledgement of the whole person. And throughout this conversation, you've also talked about how we connect back to ourselves, that connection is something that is really vital in considering a systems view of life, that we understand the connection we have with ourselves, which I think in many ways, acknowledging the whole person for ourselves is a part of that too. And I'm just curious what that connection to self has looked like for you.
So connection to self for me, well, I could tell you where it came from. It came from some deep work with psychedelics. That has been a really important piece of my life over the last couple of years. And it has allowed me to see myself and see the world around me in a different way. And so when I do psychedelics, I am not one to go take some mushrooms and go to a concert. I am more one to lay down on the couch with some, with a blindfold on, and, some really beautiful mantra type music, and do some real deep inner exploration. And I have had some of the most beautiful and profound experiences in my life in this capacity. And I have a community of others that, share this same perspective on life and the same approach. And so, there's a community that I'm connected with that, kind of has this similar perspective. And so for me, I guess one, and maybe I'll talk about my first psychedelic journey. So a couple of years back, a friend of mine, he asked if I was interested, and I had just so happened to, I had just read Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind.
It's a great book.
It is. And I came across that because I was a fan of Michael Pollan, from Omnivore's Dilemma, Botany of Desire, all of those books have been deeply influential on me and, kind of have indirectly led me to this role within regenerative agriculture, just largely inspired by Michael Pollan's writing. And so when he came out with a book on psychedelics, and myself, never been a psychedelic person, not a drug person, not any of that. I was always a straight A, straight edge, drugs are bad type person growing up, class president, all that stuff, the golden child. I, read Michael Pollan's book and go, well, that's not what I was expecting to hear from him. But, he makes some very valid points on, kind of how these compounds have been demonized, specifically, through the counterculture of the 60s. There was a very intentional demonization of psychedelics as a way to suppress the counterculture because the counterculture was anti-war. And there are quotes directly from the Nixon administration that speak to this. And so kind of looking at this and going, oh, there's a different way of seeing this that I hadn't considered before. So that opened up my mind just in terms of what are these and perhaps what am I missing? That, what is it that I have been told about this thing, whether that is human health or agriculture or psychedelics? There is this conventional wisdom that relates to all of these things that perhaps is not entirely accurate or perhaps is missing something. And so I'm open to that. I'm open to unconventional ways of thinking. So a friend invited me to this group, and in the group, when I eventually dropped in, when the drugs eventually kicked in for me, really, and it took a while. We probably started the night at 8:00 p.m. and this was 1 a.m. and I was like, I'm not feeling anything. And the guide, the facilitator, she was like, I think your brain is just too strong. It is just fighting it. It does not want to be out of control. I'm very logic driven and I understand everything. And I think there's this sense of control that has been, control and mastery and knowing that has driven me my entire life. But when it hit, what it felt like was I dropped in and then all of a sudden it felt like my heart just burst wide open and it felt like this just beams of love and light, just beaming out of me. And I just relished in that for an hour, couple hours. I don't know. It was just the most incredible sensation and feeling of love, and not just love with, a romantic partner, but just this eternal love that exists throughout the world.
Yes.
And, people talk about that and it sounds very cliche of love is the answer to all of your global problems. And it sounds very hippy dippy. And trust me, I understand that very deeply, as an engineer, left brain, I'm like, all right, hippies, get out of here. But feeling it is a very, very, very different experience than knowing it and reading about it. And for that, with that experience, being able to sit in that feeling for that period of time, I think unlocked something in me that I then understood that there is more to this world around us than that I know or that I could possibly comprehend. And ever since that moment, and since, all the other journeys that I've had that have all been different in their own way and very profound in very different ways, I feel like that rounded me out as a person, whereas before, very logic driven, perfection, mastery. With the work that I've done, the interpersonal exploration, I feel more rounded and whole as a person, that I am now more likely to sit in the present moment and just be with it. And so that can look like, where it shows up the most is when I'm with my daughter. And, sometimes, she'll just want to be held. And sometimes she'll just like bury her head onto my shoulder. And I'm able to just like close my eyes and just like resonate with that and like connect in with her. It's like this beautiful, deep, like spiritual level connection with another human. And there's something so beautiful about that. And I don't know that I was capable of fully feeling that and embodying that prior to doing this type of work. So I think what psychedelics have allowed me to do is they've allowed me to feel certain connections in life that before, I think I knew, and I'm like, I understand love and I understand, how everything works and is connected. But now, rather than understanding it, I feel it and I can be in it at this very deep state, and I can access it in a much easier way that I don't think I ever would have been able to before.
That is incredible. And I think that difference between knowing and understanding connection on a logical and intellectual level, and understanding connection on a felt and experiential level, and to experience that connection as love, which, while maybe seemingly trite, I do think speaks to a greater aspect of our human psyche here that is immensely capable of love, and perhaps not uniquely so, but I think that is a deep component. As you were speaking, I was thinking too about, have you read Lisa Miller's The Awakened Brain?
No, I haven't.
It's about the evolutionary role that spirituality plays in the human psyche, that there is actually this space in our brains that is measurable, that tends towards the spiritual, and that fulfills something within whatever it is that means to be human, that actually brings our systems into a state of balance. And she's a researcher at Columbia, and she's looked at this thoroughly through MRI scans and through multiple different research papers, that the aspect of spirituality, of love, which really is just a connection to something greater, even if that thing is nature or that thing is the love that you feel for your daughter, actually begins to change our nervous system, to change the morphology of our brains, that we are meant to connect to this. And so I think that any plant medicine that is facilitating that connection, that perhaps has been broken over time or is difficult for people like you and also myself that exist in that very left brain space to access, what a gift.
It is. And it shows itself not just in, I think the aspect of, love for your daughter, like to provide other contexts for how that embodies and to apply that towards this larger conversation we've been having. It could also be, just when I step outside on a sunny day and like there's birds chirping and like my bare feet are in the grass and, I'm able to, not because I'm like, all right, I am going to sit here and I am going to relish in this, but it's just kind of something washes over me that says, close your eyes, just soak this up real quick. How beautiful of a moment is this? Yes. And the ability to have full presence is incredibly powerful. And whether you get that through psychedelics or plant medicines or whatever you want to call them, or you get it through breath work or meditation or spirituality or rhythmic dancing or singing,
Yes.
or like there's so many different modalities that can bring it about. And so there's no one size fits all solution here, but more of a choose your own adventure and figure out what works for you as an individual. And it could be a multitude of those things that you find helpful, and then maybe some of them you don't, and that's fine. But find what works for you, because if you go back and apply this evolutionary lens to the human existence and to ecology, psychedelics have been in, there's evidence that psychedelics have been in use for millennia.
Very long time. Across many cultures.
Across all cultures.
Yes.
All of the major religions that exist today have some sort of early mystical basis, whether you're talking Christianity, which if you read Brian Mirescu's book, The Immortality Key, is fantastic.
Okay.
That one dives into early Christianity and kind of how that equates back to the Eleusinian mysteries and some evidence that he discovered there. It's fantastic.
Okay, that's going on the list.
Mike Crowley has a book called The Secret Drugs of Buddhism, which looks at early Vajrayana Buddhism and kind of the psychedelic usage there. And then you go back to, the Vedic religions and Soma, which is very clearly documented as, like the oldest religion, but, is documented as Soma is this substance that people were drinking to experience enlightenment and transcendent states. It is very clearly written out there. And then you go back even further and you look at cave art, and there's depictions of shamans and people holding mushrooms or peyote or, ergot fungus, which is the basis for LSD, and like all these other things. These have existed throughout human existence, for a long, long time,
Yes.
Before recorded history, before language and all
Perhaps
that sort of
before
stuff.
Homo sapiens and into
could
deeper
be.
lineages.
Well,
yes.
if you go back to, there's different theories out there. For example, Terence and Dennis McKenna have their stoned ape theory, which is that, early hominids walking on the African savannas, us being hunter-gatherers and, looking around for food, you would sample food, things, is this edible? Can this provide me nutrition? And if they came across psilocybe mushrooms, magic mushrooms growing out of a cow pie out there on the savannah, because they're following the ancient herbivores that existed because they are hunters and that's how they, exist and, feed themselves. Oh, here's a mushroom growing out of this cow pie. Let me try this. Boom. You see this entirely different worldview. And their theory there with the stoned ape theory is that transcendent state allowed for the growth and the development of the human brain to what it is today. Now, I'm not going to say that theory is entirely true or that I fully back that. Like, it's a theory and we don't know. And that's, I think, the important thing to recognize is that theories, just like, memes or stories or whatever it is, they are ways for the human brain to try to encapsulate the totality of an existence and understand it. And all of those ways are imperfect. There is no perfect way of encapsulating. Even science. Science is a way, whether it's science or art or whatever it may be, it's a way of trying to understand the world and to show it and to express it and understand it. And there's going to be imperfections. Science is always coming up with new discoveries each and every day.
It's a process.
Yeah, it's a process. And that's what life is. It's a process. And we're trying to understand our place in it. And we'll never understand our place in it fully, but we can embody it. And we don't need to understand it fully to embody it and be present in it.
And I think that aspect that we're never going to understand our place in it is an important part of this, that we are, in many ways constantly oscillating between the quest for deeper understanding, though not finite understanding, and this sense of just wanting to be present, to be here and now, to not be going after that deeper end point of knowledge that doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think so much of this is interesting because I think it is this holistic view of life that actually brought me on my own spiritual journey. Like
Mm-hmm.
I came to it through the lens of better understanding ecology, from
Mm-hmm.
finding ecological literacy and seeing that connection between everything and feeling a sense of rightness and connectedness in a greater sense than I had ever experienced.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think in many ways that's a really great place to begin to lead us back into some of that ecological view through the lens of your work at Savory.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah. Where do we start?
yeah, where do we start? So you mentioned a couple of things that had been on my list. You mentioned looking at carbon as a single metric, and maybe we want to kind of give an overview of Savory first, but
Mm-hmm.
looking at carbon as just the single metric, to put a Band-Aid on and not,
Mm-hmm.
and nutrient cycling, which I was
Mm-hmm.
recently listening to a podcast with you, and I heard you speak about nutrient cycling in a way that really piqued my curiosity. And
Mm.
so I want to at least get back to those things, but let's talk about the work that Savory does in grasslands, because coming
Sure.
from the West, I mean, this was my passion. That's what led me to butchery, was seeing how
Mm-hmm.
grasslands could be regenerated with what, and I loved this, you called ruminants as engineers of an ecosystem. So
Mm-hmm.
let's
They are.
start there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, ruminants have co-evolved with grasslands for millennia. If you go back and look, you take this evolutionary perspective on life. What's the quote that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution? I forget who said that, but it's such a powerful quote. And if you apply that and say, okay, how can I look at the world around me through this evolutionary lens, you'll see some patterns of how life used to exist before things rapidly shifted in the last couple hundred, couple thousand of years, whatever, frame of time you want to look at. And from that evolutionary lens, you see that for millennia, grasslands, which are 1/3 of the Earth's landmass, 5 billion hectares or 12.5 billion acres, they have always existed with ruminant animals on them, with grazing herbivores that have moved across those landscapes. Grazing herbivores are they are prey to pack hunting predators, and so as herbivores, their protective mechanism is to bunch up into a herd, and that changes the behavior of the herd, because when you are bunched up in a herd, you are going to be less selective of the plants that you eat in front of you. Because you are tightly bunched, there is going to be a lot of impact on that land. Those hooves are really going to disturb the soil, which is going to allow for better water infiltration. It's going to allow for the urine and the dung to be better incorporated into it. And that urine and dung acts as a natural fertilizer for that land. But then the cattle, obviously don't want to be standing in their own urine and dung, so they move along to a fresh pasture of grass. And so the herd moves about in this kind of natural migration across a landscape because of the predator-prey balance. Because, say in North America, because of the gray wolf, they would stay tightly bunched up. You can say the same thing for, look at the great wildebeest migration, which still exists in Africa, or you look at, caribou, or, pick any type of ruminant animal that exists on this planet, and there's a predator that is changing the dynamics of how that animal exists. Well, if you look at the modern context, most of our grazing herbivores have been domesticated. So, instead of bison roaming across North America, with unfettered access to the prairies, now we have cattle that are mostly contained in feedlots, some out on pasture. And we have put up roads and fences and other infrastructure that doesn't allow for them to move about. We've also killed off most of their predators. There's some efforts to reintroduce wolves in the U.S., but I mean, the numbers of grazing herbivores and predators, to have that proper predator-prey dynamic would be immense that we'd never be able to fully get to given just the physical development of the landscape that we have here in the States and in many places around the world. So how do you replicate that dynamic in this modern context? Like we were saying, we don't want to romanticize the past and say, let's take down all the fences, let's break up all the roads and cities, and let's go all live out in the woods again. You know, how do you embrace that relationship of life, predator and prey and grassland, you know, plants and animals, predator and prey? How do you embrace that in this modern context? And there's a way that you can do it by planning the grazing. Instead of the wolves acting as the prey that keeps the livestock bunched up and moving about, humans can come in with portable electric fencing, or you could be a shepherd that's walking with your flock, or a herder that's moving your cattle, or you put up permanent fencing and you just move them about from pasture to pasture. And you plan the movements through pastures based on the growth rates and the recovery rates of those grasses so that you can ensure the greatest ecological function and desired outcomes there. And so that's what is entailed within that component of holistic planned grazing that we teach at the Savory Institute. It's planning your grazing in a way that's going to mimic those ancestral migratory patterns and behaviors of the animals so that you get the proper animal impact, so that you are planning for the recovery periods of those grasses, and so that you are considering the whole of what is going on that landscape, not just focusing on the cattle, but also the natural wildlife, the biodiversity of species. All of those are factored into the planning process in one way, shape, or form. So that's what we do as a nonprofit. Savory Institute's a nonprofit. We teach that to farmers and ranchers and pastoralist communities across the globe. And that looks different in all different contexts. So, we work with the Maasai in Kenya, and the way they graze is going to look very different from gauchos in Patagonia. It's going to look different from reindeer herders in Norway, and that's going to look very different from cowboys in the American West. And it's going to look very different from you and Josh's farm in upstate New York. And so all of these are grazing herbivores on grass, but they exist within a very different context, whether that's a cultural context or geography or soil type or grass species or local markets and policy and laws or whatever it may be.
All of the above.
All of the above are all factored in and all at play whenever you make a decision. So there's no one size fits all approach to how you graze animals in a regenerative manner. Rather, there are some inherent pieces of ecological literacy that are important to understand, like energy flow, how much photosynthesis is happening, how much sun are you capturing through grass, how much is your water cycling through the land properly? Are your nutrients cycling through the land properly? That urine and dung, is it incorporating? And the community dynamics, the biodiversity and the succession of species. And so we have those four pieces of those four ecosystem processes that we teach. And then we teach the grazing planning, and we teach the decision-making framework to ensure that all decisions are made within that holistic context, that guiding North Star to make sure that you aren't taking a reductionist mechanical approach to how you make decisions when you're dealing with the infinite complexities of land and livestock and how they affect not just your land and your livestock, but the communities around you and the people that eat your food and everything.
The ecosystem as a whole.
Yeah.
So
that's what we do at Savory.
I think that this is so important. And I think that it's become dogmatic in this space that there's this prescriptive single solution for how this is done. And this is giving instead an entire context that is considering all these different components of that system. And so And it's incredibly important to do that, because how would that be if the Savory Institute, there's 17 of us, we're headquartered in Boulder, but we kind of exist throughout the States. We've got one person who lives in Spain. If we were to show up to the Masai Mara, in Kenya and say, this is how you have to do this. I have figured it all out. Me, that's this very, that's happened a lot in history, and it hasn't really gone over well. No, it has not.
And so it's important to have that humility in saying the people that the people that know best, the people that are going to do it right, are the people that are doing it directly, the people that are on the ground, that have that connection to the land, and they understand it and they are living it day to day. They are the ones that need to be making these decisions. They are the ones that know how this works. Sometimes they just may need a little bit of guidance through a framework that helps them understand that context that they exist in. And so it really gives agency back to the land manager, and allows for creativity and innovation and adaptation, which is really the most important part, because you go back to complex adaptive living systems, weather events are going to change, you're going to get pests that come in, the market price changes, like all these variables are always at play. And so if you're following a prescription of like, well, I have to do this next and I have to do this, there's going to be unintended consequences. And it's better to look at the whole of what they are managing and allow them to figure out what is the best thing for my land base, given the context in which I exist and what I want to come out of it.
Yes. And I think that something really struck me in there, that you are not only teaching critical thinking, which I think is incredibly important to look at complexity, but you are also tapping into humans' innate ability to be critical thinkers, to see this as a whole, right? That this concept isn't lost. It's just, maybe it's buried, and to really tap into that across a very wide range of landscapes and cultures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That traditional ecological knowledge, has always existed. And I think credit is due to indigenous cultures that for millennia have better existed within their environment than Western cultures presently do. And, that is to recognize that indigenous cultures are still here and are still managing land and have, traditions and cultures and ritual and whatever it may be that allow for a greater reverence to the world around them. And through traditions and storytelling and myth and whatever it may be, there are lessons that exist there that are timeless and are how previous generations were able to express their understanding of the world around them. And in our modern era, we express that understanding through the scientific process and peer-reviewed literature. And it's like, well, in Nature, so-and-so published that when you do this, this happens. And look at this wonderful discovery. And that's one form of knowledge transmission, but it's not the only form of knowledge transmission. Knowledge transfer also happens through storytelling. And it could be through a myth of, this magical creature that came and embodied the spirit of blah, 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 not to to write it off by saying blah, blah,
You're
blah.
not.
That probably could be misinterpreted. But to say that through the creation of myth and storytelling and origin stories, deeply embedded within those are understandings and learnings of how the world works. And the outcome of transmitting those stories is a development of reverence and increased connection to the world around you. And there's incredible value in that. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that these aspects of cultures outside of our own may seem foreign and we may not always understand them, but those things exist for a reason, and they wouldn't exist if they didn't confer some sort of evolutionary advantage towards that culture. And so it's important to acknowledge that and embrace that. And perhaps we won't understand exactly how this origin story allowed this culture to do X, Y, and Z, or how that is applicable in, the present year. But we don't need to understand that. All we need to do is hear it and respect it. And that is like the embodiment of those stories, and holism is just embracing what has come about before us and trying to integrate that into the present moment, because life builds on life. And so
Yes.
the best we can do is exist in the present day and integrate what has come before us with reverence.
I'm blown away by what you said, and there is almost this concept of story as an emergent property of culture, and as something that's incredibly important within a system, and that just resonates really deeply for me, and something that has to be incorporated in how we move forward within cultures. And story is something that I think is incredibly crucial to how we move forward. I think this is my attempt at storytelling, because I think that we better understand the lens through the world, the way that the world functions through the lens of people telling us their stories, and getting that chance to connect with maybe a different viewpoint, or to connect with different ideas, and to truly connect. And I think that there is an evolutionary precedent for telling stories around the fire, that is really where we exchanged information. And I'm always curious.
Where we exchanged information. It's where we cooked our food.
Yes.
It's where we kept ourselves warm and safe. And so it warded off predators. And so there's that deep yearning in all of us. Like whenever you see a campfire, you know how everyone just kind of is like blankly staring into the fire?
Yeah.
Like that's something within us, because we are naturally drawn to it, because it is safety, it is survival, it is sustenance, it is sharing and connection and community. Like fire, is the holder of all of that for us. So naturally we are drawn to it, because those that came before us, whose genetic makeup was not attracted to fire, they were the ones out moseying around, across the savannah out on their own, while everyone else was gathered around the fire, and they got eaten by the lions.
Yeah, not a good survival strategy.
They didn't reproduce. Evolution was not in their favor, and so the traits that exist today exist because they were selected for through evolutionary pressure over time.
Yes, and with story being a part of that, maybe that's harder to look at through that reductionist scientific lens, but is undoubtedly part and parcel of the human experience.
Yeah, well, you talk about like this being storytelling, which I would agree. It's an exploration to try to understand more of the whole that is Bobby, or that is Kate, or that is Savory Institute, or that is Western Daughters, or whatever it may be. It's a deeper dive into understanding the complexities of that, acknowledging that I will never be able to fully express exactly who I am on a microphone, on a podcast. And the reductionist approach to that would be like, if you just read my bio and you're like, well, Bobby's a biomedical engineer. He does communications and fundraising for Savory. He's a father. He used to be, a competitive ultra runner, and blah. Like you throw some labels out there, and labels do such a poor job of truly encapsulating a thing, whether that is a person, whether that is an ethos that you live by, a philosophy, a practice. Like it's so easy to place a label on something, but that label does such a poor job of speaking to the complexity and richness of what that thing is. And I think that's what makes labels easy to attack. You mentioned Charles Eisenstein earlier, which I love him. I love Charles Eisenstein, especially his book, The More Beautiful World Our Hearts Know Is Possible.
It's a beautiful book.
And it's so good. And in that book, he talks about the othering that we do as humans. We have a tendency to view ourselves, our community, our tribe, and then there are the others. And you create this separation. And you look at them and say, well, they are, their political beliefs are X. So therefore, I am the inner group. They are the outer group. They are the opposition. They are the other. and we are the good guys, they're the bad guys. Like, we do this everywhere. My diet is better than this diet, and my group is better than this group. And like, we do that over and over and over again as humans. And all that's doing is it is divorcing ourselves from others that are actually connected to us.
Yes.
Those people that we other for one reason or another, because we say, well, your diet doesn't consider X, Y, and Z, and therefore it's wrong, and mine does X, Y, and Z, ABC, so therefore it's right. Like, what you're doing is you're separating yourself from others in the world around you, but we all exist because of others around us. Everyone has a contribution in this world, whether, you are the cable guy who has, established the cable that we are using for this podcast, or you're a farmer that's growing the food, or you're a butcher that is selling it to you, or, you're a politician that's making policy that informs all the things, whether you agree with it or not. Like, everyone contributes in some way to the world in which we exist. And like, in the grander scheme of things, the carbon that we are made of will eventually become the carbon of other living things into the future. So like, our existence depends on the existence of others that came before us, and will contribute to the existence of those that come after us, as will the decisions we make during our time here on this planet. Those decisions we make will form the world around us, and that world around us will be what those life forms that come next will exist within, and they will form that landscape, and it will go on and on and on, just as it always has. And I think it's important to recognize that, and to not other folks and try to separate yourself from them, because when you create, when you slap a label on something and you create this separation, you are disavowing the truth of what is life. Yes. There is an inherent connection that exists between all of us, and we have to embrace that. And so even if you disagree with someone because of their political beliefs or their dietary choices or whatever it may be, you still depend on them and they still depend on you, and there's nothing you can do about that.
And we are still connected within this web of life in ways, and impacting each other in ways that I think we can only begin to imagine. And I think that when we find connection with people, especially people that are different from us, that might not share all of our same viewpoints, I think we find a deeper level of humanity and a deeper level of understanding for ourselves, for others, and for what we are building, that this is the foundation that we grow from this point on. Well, and we are creating that system.
It goes back, like I was saying with the example of my daughter, with acknowledging the totality of the whole human. Who she is. Yeah, that human existence. I am acknowledging your humanity. I'm acknowledging what you're experiencing and what you're expressing. And we can do that to everyone we come across in some way or another. And it is seeing the other person. It is acknowledging their existence and their humanity and their opinion and perspective, and not trying to put them in some box so that we can other them and categorize and reduce the vast complexity of who they are and the world around them and how they operate with the world around them. Like, how can we acknowledge that existence and how that then connects back to us? Yeah.
I couldn't have said it better myself. And this is something that this conversation is present at our breakfast table, at our dinner table, multiple times a week right now. I think this is a really big piece of something that's in my heart, is how do we build bridges, not tear them down? And
we talk about in the, with the Savory Institute, we jokingly refer to the different groups that, the different, if there's a Venn diagram of two desperate groups, we kind of exist in the middle, and those are kind of the Boots and the Birkenstocks. So we're dealing with regenerative agriculture, which, is very much, land-based, farming and ranching, rural communities, the Boots. But then also there's this aspect of where removing carbon from the atmosphere, putting it back into soil, in service to life. We're improving wildlife habitat and, water quality and improving food systems. Like there's very much like the crunchy Birkenstock environmentalist aspect there. And we exist with both.
Yes.
And I wear both boots and Birkenstocks. Because
literally.
I embrace both of, literally I wear both of those on a daily basis.
You live in Colorado.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So it depends on which part of Colorado I'm going into. But, I think it would be easy to categorize, well, we work with ranchers, so we are going to fit squarely into this box. Or no, we are only going to talk about climate change and carbon and environmentalism, and we are going to fit squarely into this box. But that doesn't speak to the fullness of what we are doing and what we are bringing to people and communities. And so we engage with farmers and ranchers and pastoralists that come from all different walks of life, who normally would never, be engaging with one another. Yet within this global network that we have at the Savory Institute, people from all different walks of life coming together and sharing stories and learnings and opportunities with one another, whether it is something related to beef production or reversing climate change, getting grants for that, or, whatever it may be. There's all of these pieces that are at play, and it's finding that commonality between them that I think our work does.
I love that. And, that was a big impetus for Western Daughters, is how do we bridge this gap between urban consumers of food and rural producers of food, and help each side understand better the other, so that we can create a more robust, more resilient food system that is composed of producers and eaters at both the macro level and the level of soil, that the microcosm mirrors the macrocosm in this way. And so I love that. I want to dive in. I have to ask you, I have a couple of, how long do I have you here for? I don't want to.
However long you want.
Okay. Then I'm going to take it. Then I'm taking it.
Go for it. I might need a bathroom break at some point.
That's fine. We can edit that. We can edit anything.
I don't know if you just do this raw audio that goes straight out, or if you're editing or anything.
I edit and put things together.
Okay.
You mentioned something that I've been thinking about a lot, and I want to kind of tie it in. I was listening to one of your podcasts, and you were talking about nutrient cycling, particularly in the context of brittle grasslands and the necessity of moisture from animal manure and urine in order to get those nutrients back into the soil. And I want you to explain that, but I have been thinking a lot about the loss of nutrient density in both plants and animals over the last 50, 60, however many years, and how that's affecting human health, right? This sort of trophic cascade, this bioaccumulation of nutrients up the food chain, and the critical nature of ensuring that those nutrients are in the soil so that they can be in our vegetables, so that they can be in our meat. And I think that with meat in particular, I know that Fred Provenza and there's a gentleman, I forget his name, are doing some really interesting research. Do you know?
Stefan Van Vliet from Duke.
Thank you. Are doing some really interesting research on how the biodiversity and the type of forage and the health of soil actually impacts the nutrient density of the meat that you are eating. And so I think that this is a pretty macro conversation, but I'm curious to unpack it with you through this lens of nutrient cycling.
Yeah, so the nutrient cycling perspective, which also is related to water cycles, you can't really divorce one from the other. All of these things are interrelated. I think the statistic is that when you increase soil organic matter by 1%, you improve the water holding capacity of 1 acre of land by 20,000 additional gallons. So, the ability for that soil as a sponge to hold water is directly connected to the soil organic matter that exists within that. Because the soil organic matter, when that is richer and in higher concentrations, there's going to be greater soil life. So you're going to have greater microbes and earthworms and mycorrhizal fungi that are all tunneling through the soil, that are creating more porosity, which allows for water to better penetrate and soak in, and a variety of other different factors there. But to go back to the concept of brittleness, the brittleness is one of the what we call the 4 key insights of holistic management. I've mentioned a few of them in the podcast already. So holism being probably the first and most important, the interconnectedness that nature functions in wholes, whole person, whole ecosystem, whole landscape, etc. The second being the predator-prey connection, which we talked about. So, how do the wolves and the bison, exist together, and how does that affect the behavior and the dynamics across that landscape? The third key insight being timing. So this being that the recovery rate of the grass, that overgrazing is a function of time, not a function of how many animals are on a piece of land. So you can have a ton of animals on a piece of land, but if you get them off of that land quick enough, they will not overgraze the grasses. Overgrazing is a function of time, not animals. And so if you are able to plan your movements according to how can I ensure that when a cow takes a bite off of a blade of grass, when you take a bite off of a blade of grass, the roots are gonna then slough off some of that energy to go back into the reproduction of the above ground component. And then after that above ground component has regrown, then the roots are gonna fully regrow. But if a new sprout of grass has come up and the cow comes and takes a bite off of that before the roots have fully developed, that is then going to be decreasing the vigor of that plant species, and eventually it will die because it hasn't had a chance to fully recover. So anyways, timing being one of those key insights as it relates to overgrazing. And then the fourth key insight is brittleness. And brittleness refers to the distribution of moisture throughout the year across a landscape. So what does that mean? Well, where you are in New York, you probably have precipitation, not every day, but generally speaking throughout the year.
Yes.
And that is going to lead to green vegetative growth, forage actively growing year round. You have a year-round growing system. Now, sometimes it might be more vigorously growing than at other times of year, but 12 months of the year, you've got a growing season. In other parts of the world, for example, Colorado, where I am, there is a very distinct growing season, and there's a very distinct non-growing season or dormant season. And that's because of the weather patterns and because of how precipitation falls on this landscape. And so you can attest to having lived in both locations that Colorado landscape looks very different than upstate New York or than a typical coastal place might look. And that's because in Colorado, it's going to green up probably around mid-April, and it's going to stay green. The grasses are going to start to turn brown or tan probably July, August, and then it gets very dormant. There's no more growth. And then we get snow throughout the winter, but that moisture that comes from the snow, because it's frozen, it's locked up, it's not accessible to the grass. That moisture then melts in the spring, and that's when the green up happens. So we've got our growing season, we've got our non-growing season. The thing about moisture is that moisture is a necessary component for the decomposition of materials, of organic matter. So when you have grass for that biological matter to decay and become soil, it needs two things. It needs microbes and it needs moisture. Where do you get moisture and microbes year round in a dry, brittle landscape during the non-growing season? This is a question that we'll normally ask people when we're out on the ranch. We'll say, look around you. Where year round will you find that moisture and those microbes? Because you might be in a dry spell where you haven't had moisture for the last 3-4 months. So how is that grass going to decompose and cycle back into the soil? And the answer is that it occurs in the rumen of the herbivore. So herbivores have 4 chambers of the stomach. The first chamber is a rumen, and essentially it's a fermentation vat that is filled with microbes. And what those microbes do is they take the grasses and they break down the cellulose and they turn that into energy that is then digested by the animal. And that comes out as dung on the back end of the animal, which then can reincorporate as fertility and soil life. So herbivores play a critical role in the health of grassland ecosystems, especially grassland ecosystems that have a very defined non-growing or dormant season. The herbivore is critical to the continued cycling of nutrients in that system because they have this special chamber of the stomach that other animals do not have that is absolutely necessary to continue the cycling and breaking down of grasses and turning that into soil fertility, cycling those nutrients back into the land. So that realization that when you have a growing season and a non-growing season, grazing herbivores are critically important. That is a key piece of holistic management and how we make decisions. And the term brittleness, to describe that a little more clearly, brittleness is on a scale of 1 to 10. And so, on a scale, if you're a 1 or a 0 on the brittleness scale, that means you're not brittle at all. So that would be somewhere that has year-round moisture. That's like a jungle. There is moisture all the time. It is extremely non-brittle. If you grab a handful of grass, you pull it off the ground, and you crunch it in your hand, it's going to bounce back. It's not brittle at all. In Colorado, if you're in the dormant season, you grab a handful of grass, you squish it in your hand, it's not going to squish, it's going to crunch. It's a very brittle grass that's going to break down because it is in a dormant phase. And so a 10 on the brittleness scale would be a true desert. So you go from like jungle to desert. That's kind of 0 to 10. And most people fall somewhere in the middle. In upstate New York, you're probably more like a 1 or a 2. In Colorado, or probably where I am, it's probably like 7 or 8. And that depends on where you are. There's other places in Colorado that have year-round moisture that do lean a little more non-brittle. For example, in the Gunnison Valley, the way that the precipitation hits there, just because of the mountain features and the way that the weather works, they tend to be a little more non-brittle than other parts of Colorado. And so the way that you manage your animals across that landscape is going to change based on where you are on the brittleness scale. If you have year-round available forage and continuous moisture, you're going to be able to make decisions. The landscape is going to be a little more forgiving to your management decisions. In a dry, arid, brittle landscape, the land is a little less forgiving. It's also not as productive because you have that period of the year that forage is not growing. And so the way that you manage your herd across that landscape is going to change. What that looks like is, instead of having a grazing plan that is what we call an open grazing plan, which is you're constantly monitoring the growth because there's new grass to be had. I'm finding new growth. You're planning constantly based on where the grass is, how much it's growing, and when. When you have a non-growing season, you essentially have a reserve of grass. Okay, the spigot is turned off for the year. We now have this much forage. This much forage has to last us until we get more rain and more green growth in the spring. So we need to ration the grass that we have. Also, the grass isn't actively growing, so the consideration of overgrazing is not something that is factored in because you're not in an active growing phase. Active growth is one of those factors of timing, like I was saying, that applies towards the management decisions you make. So all of these pieces kind of interrelate to one another, and they are factors that are considered when you plan the grazing of animals across a landscape. You're looking at the 4 ecosystem processes, you're acknowledging the holism, the predator-prey connection, the timing for overgrazing, and the brittleness, And you're acknowledging that within your context of who are the decision makers, what do you want out of this, how do you manage to the triple bottom line, and then you include those feedback loops to make decisions and see and check, did those decisions lead me in the direction I want to be going? And that's kind of the totality of everything together.
I love this. And I think that this is something that is really missing in the conversations that I'm seeing happen in the greater meat and regenerative agriculture space that really explain how nutrients find themselves back in the soil. I see a lot of talking about the deficit of nutrients in the end products, in vegetables, in meat, and not a lot of talking about how those nutrients are end up there or are maintained within that system.
Yeah. Well, in terms of those nutrients, where do those nutrients come from? So those nutrients come from a diversity of plant species, which then the livestock eat and convert into the animal protein and
into
fats
biomass.
Into biomass. And so you go back and look at the forage and the biodiversity that is growing on that landscape. And how do you ensure that you are creating a biodiverse habitat? Well, it goes back to managing in a way that is going to honor those ecosystem processes and those key insights. If you are making decisions in line with that, biodiversity should be resulting from that. And then you can get into some of the mechanical explanations of it in terms of, okay, if you have better nutrient cycling because you're using grazing herbivores to cycle nutrients at all times of the year, to making sure that that fertility is going back into the soil. Well, then you are changing the fungal bacterial ratios of the soil. And if you are more fungal dominated, then the fungi are going to be mining minerals from the rocks at deeper depths, and they are going to be bringing those up through the mycorrhizal fungi, this mycorrhizal web of life that exists under the soil, and they are going to be taking what they grabbed from rocks and they mined from that, and they're going to be exchanging that with the root tips of the perennial grasses, because the perennial grasses are saying, hey, I can take sunlight and turn it into sugar, and the fungi are saying, I can take rocks and turn it into nutrients, and they're saying, dope, I want some of that. Mm-hmm. Let's trade these. And so they exchange sugars and nutrients for one another. And then that leads to better plant vigor, which leads to healthier grass species, which makes them more palatable and desirable for the livestock. And if you go back, you had mentioned Fred Provenza and Stefan Van Vliet from Fred's at Utah State University, Stefan's at Duke. They do lots of incredible work. And, I'll give a plug for Fred's book, Nourishment.
Yeah, Nourishment.
Or Nourished or Nourished,
I always get them
whatever the title is.
We'll link to it.
It's on my bookshelf around the corner. I can't look at it quickly. But anyways, it's a fantastic book. And it speaks to the innate nutritional wisdom of wildlife and animals, that if they are given a plethora of plant species, they are going to go and eat the species that provide them with the nutritional components that they need for species richness. And that can be defined as a bunch of different things, but without them saying, hey, I need calcium and therefore I'm going to go eat this plant. They just genuinely know their palate drives them to eat something that they need. And so it's important in that context to not just have lots of green grass, because you could have lots of green grass of one species of grass, and that might not be filling the nutritional needs of those animals. So having a biodiversity of plant species growing, and not just different types of species, but some species that are young, some species that are more established, some that have just started growing, some that are kind of in that teenage growth phase where they're sprouting up really, all of those factors contribute towards the nutrient density that exists within the forage. And then that nutrition is what the animal then eats and converts into biomass that we then eat. And you can see that, whether that's carotenoids that make the fats,
Yes.
the fat cap on your steak more orange,
that's
or
seasonal
makes
too. But yes,
exactly.
As a butcher, I'm just going to say that's also seasonal.
Well, and it speaks to the seasonality of the grasses and what they are doing and what stage of growth they are in and how the seasons change. And so all of these things are seasonal. And so the nutrient density of the food that we eat is dependent on the diversity of species that the animals have access to. And that's not to say that there should just be full unfettered access to the full ranch at all times so that they can pick and choose what they want, because if they do that, they may be, just like as humans, we have a tendency to overeat things that we find pleasurable. So do other animals. We all have that tendency, but if they are within a herd, there's a lesser tendency. They're going to eat what they need, and then they're going to move on, and then they're going to find others that provide that same need. So there's a way of getting that nutrition while not overgrazing the landscape that comes into the dynamics there as well.
And I think there's this other piece, and then their manure, their urine is actually creating an increase of diversity within the soil system, within these bacterial and fungal communities, which is then increasing its ability to pull nutrients and to have this conversation between plant root and fungi. And there's this concept that life begets more life, right? That an ecosystem tends towards creating more life. And I think that ruminants really exemplify in an almost a keystone species, in that they really begin to create more life in the soil, more diversity in the plants, more diversity in the small wildlife that is there, birds and rabbits,
pollinators and everything. Yeah.
All of these things. And it is tending towards increasing complexity and an increase in life. And that is reflected in the nutrient density of the resulting meat. And I'm very interested in this piece right now, is what I'll say.
Yeah. Well, I think what that speaks to right there is that every life form fulfills an ecological niche. Every life form is contributing something in some way, and together those build upon one another and add to the complexity of life. And the more complex a system, the more resilient and healthy it is. It's when we have simplified communities, i.e. monocultures, that we run into problems. So nature thrives on complexity and nature abhors a vacuum. And so when you mismanage a landscape because of overgrazing or whatever it may be, or overrest is the opposite of overgrazing, but that's one that people don't often think of. If you leave grasses and they never get grazed, that becomes a problem as well, because they will then go senescent and they will die, and they will block out the sunlight for new plants to regrow, and they will occupy that space without ever having fully decomposed and cycled back into the soil,
resulting in desertification.
Yes, absolutely. Desertification being a product of many things, but overgrazing, undergrazing, i.e. overrest. You can see both of those within a same pasture, and we call that partial rest. And that's when animals have free choice for a long period of time to the grasses. So they are going to overgraze their favorite species, and they are going to neglect their less desirable species. And that's going to lead to overgrazing of some and overrest of others, the death of all. And so that is also a problem and is a factor of management and how the behavior and movement of those animals across that landscape. I forget what the question was. Man, I do this so often where I just go down this rabbit hole and I'm like, how did we get here?
You're great. We got here talking about nutrient density just within meat and how that is bioaccumulating up the food chain. And I think that we've really uncovered a lot of that process. And I think we've sort of naturally found ourselves in desertification. And one thing we don't have to go into a big conversation around it, just how much of our soils, how much of our grasslands are in this process of desertification, whether it's from overrest or overgrazing, and just how critical these concepts are to our future.
I mean, it's the numbers are staggering, and it depends on whose numbers you're looking at. But depending on whose numbers you're looking at, it's anywhere from 30 to 70% of global grasslands are degrading and turning to desert, process known as desertification. And that is horrible, because not just for the ecosystem processes, you know, the carbon sequestration that grasslands provide to all of us globally, you know, they are, you know, being 1/3 of the Earth's landmass, they are a critical player in regulating our climate and sequestering carbon into the soil. But also, there are 500 million people whose livelihoods depend on livestock as their main source of income. There are plenty of species who call grasslands home. You know, we talked about how water cycles equate to soil organic matter. So you look at not just the small water cycle that exists within a landscape, but then how that translates out to the larger water cycles that exist in terms of drought cycles that we are existing in, or that we are seeing in many parts of the globe.
Can you unpack that just a little bit more? This.
Oh yeah, here. Okay.
Because I'm not familiar with this, and I want to be.
So there are small and large water cycles, and here is where I will probably refer to a gentleman named Walter Jenne, Jehne. He's an Australian, I believe. Anyways, he's a master when it comes to really understanding water cycles. But so, okay, where do I start? God. So let's go back to photosynthesis. So photosynthesis, let's imagine a blade of grass, and you have CO2, and you have sunlight, and you have H2O. Those are the components on the beginning end of the equation. Or no, not H2O, O2, oxygen. So you have sunlight, and you have oxygen and CO2. Those things are processed through photosynthesis, and they create sugars that are then transmitted underground, as we discussed. And the byproduct of that is H2O. It's water. So the byproduct of photosynthesis is H2O. And water has a cooling effect in the atmosphere. So the more photosynthesis that is happening on a landscape, the more water vapor that is transpiring out of those grasses, and it's creating a cooling effect within that landscape. There is also, as we talked about, the water holding capacity of that soil sponge. So when it rains, how much of that water is being absorbed by the soil sponge to be used at a later date for vegetation growth. When the soil then reaches its full saturation point, it then begins to take any excess water that is then used to recharge underground aquifers, and that's where rivers and streams come from. And so rivers and streams, the health of those, the health of the plant vigor on our landscape, all ties back to how much vegetation is actively growing on that landscape, and if those water and nutrient cycles are healthy on that landscape.
Beautiful. I was missing a little piece of that, and that was beautifully explained.
Those then contribute towards the greater water cycles. For example, how rain clouds are formed, and the larger cycles there, which, you know, are a factor of the small water cycles existing on all different landscapes. You think that the water vapor and the moisture that's created in the air of that landscape affects the temperature of that. Well, if you have a landscape that is bare ground versus a landscape that is covered in grass, there's going to be a great temperature difference between the two of them. And the temperature difference between the two of them is going to affect weather patterns, because weather has, clouds are affected by the heat that is coming off of a landscape or not. And so by creating landscapes that have different temperatures than what they should have, it is changing the trajectory of how clouds and moisture moves across landscapes and can change weather patterns that you would typically see. And so that is more the larger water cycles. And so when you look at drought, for example, you can, kind of go back and see how the management on an individual piece of land affects the small water cycle there on that landscape, but then also that how that and other landscapes in the surrounding region contribute towards the larger water cycle and if they get rainfall or not.
This is a beautiful deepening of the daisy world experiment that Capra outlines in Systems View of Life, which really helped me better understand where you have this initial, and this is going to be a very basic concept of how life is impacting the climate and the environment. You take a world that has the potential for generating both black and white daisies, and those daisies exist within a very narrow temperature gradient that they grow between, 44 and 54 degrees Celsius. I don't remember exactly what it is. And you take the heat of the sun, and initially you see a band of black daisies pop up on the belt of this planet. And those black daisies then reflect heat back into the atmosphere and begin to warm the planet up a little bit, which allow for the white daisies to begin to populate just above and below the equator. And that those daisies are then going to have a slightly cooling effect that are in the way that they reflect light and begin to balance the system. And as the world begins to heat up a little bit, you see these daisies populate a greater and greater delta of latitudes throughout the world and create this feedback loop that is creating the environment.
Yeah, and I think so. That was a computer simulation, I believe, that someone did that Frishoff talks about in his book. But it speaks to how the feedback loops and interconnected dynamics of all these aspects of life influence one another. And so, that is a extreme simplification of black daisies and white daisies, and operating within temperature bands. But when you think of it as, okay, our decisions of how we manage animals on a landscape affects nutrient density and the CO2 concentrations and the water cycles, the small water cycles, the large water cycles. It affects wildlife habitat, and those wildlife affect their habitat. All of these things being interconnected, and it's impossible really to have a full understanding of how one decision you make will, what all the downstream effects of that will be, because there are so many of them at play. And there's randomness that is always a factor in living systems that you need to acknowledge. But there's everything affects everything else in so many different ways, whether you're talking from a thermodynamic aspect, whether you're talking about nutrient cycles, whether you're talking about water, whether you're talking about how behavior affects the behavior of other things. All of this stuff, you pull on a string in nature and you see that everything's connected.
This kind of leads me into a sort of greater conversation, and I'm really curious on your perspective on this. As we talk about removing ruminants from the environment, or we have these conversations around taxing ruminants because of their methane emissions. And as we sort of shift into this, I don't want to call it a vilification, but this very critical lens of looking at the way that meat and livestock plays within our environment. And I think that you especially, I noticed when I pulled up your TED Talk, it had a little cautionary, a little disclaimer on it. And I think that we are really tending towards these things. Just this week in Canada, they are proposing that they put a health label on ground beef, which doesn't speak to, I know there are initiatives in both Ireland and I believe New Zealand to tax methane emissions from livestock. And I'm curious what you think about this.
It's I will say, I think these efforts and initiatives come from a place of goodwill.
I agree.
think people have the best of intentions, and it's important to acknowledge that and recognize that, because acknowledging the goodwill that someone is attempting to do, but perhaps missing the full ecological literacy to understand what it truly is that they are requiring or asking for, I think that, creates a different dynamic, between sides in an argument. But yeah, the vilification or, the narrative surrounding livestock is that livestock, specifically cows seem to be
at the butt of this,
cow,
yes.
The sacrificial goat, whatever it may be.
Scapegoat.
They seem to get the scapegoat. That's the term. There's like black sheep, scapegoat, sacred cow. We need a term for bison.
We do.
But yeah, but that's all to say, livestock and specifically cows are, pointed at as this villain in our environmental discussions. And I think where that arises from, at least surface level, is from feedlots, the industrialization of agriculture. That is an abhorrent system that flies in the face of the laws of the natural world and does not respect them. And it creates an immense amount of waste, and does not operate in a cyclical function like nature does. And so there is land degradation, there's methane emissions, there is incredible amounts of fossil fuel usage for the growing of commodity crops that is used as feed, and also, in the machines themselves, and, analyze it from a million different ways. Industrial agriculture is a huge problem. Industrial agriculture is not the only option, though, and I think that's where people get it wrong. The narrative has been defined as plants versus animals.
Yes.
And I think that is an unfair characterization, because not all livestock is created equal. You can raise animals in a feedlot, or you can raise them 100% of their life on pasture in a way that regenerates the health of the ecosystem, like we've been discussing for the last 2 hours. Like, it is entirely possible to do it. The data supports it. The pictures of before and after, or the fence line comparisons, are breathtaking.
Yes.
And when you see it firsthand, it resonates in you, where you, just like we are drawn to a fire because it provides that safety for us, we are drawn to a healthy grassland, open landscape. There's something about it that just feels right, with, deep in your bones. You're just like, oh God, this is so beautiful and so right. And so it's possible to raise animals in a way that is a net positive for the world we live in. But the narrative has been made that it's plant versus animals. I think a more appropriate narrative would be industrial agriculture versus a more holistic, nature-based approach to agriculture. And that, I think, frames the conversation in a more appropriate manner and speaks to the fact that agriculture can exist, good or bad, both in plant and animal agriculture. Just as you have feedlots, you have vast monocultures of crops that are contributing towards desertification and soil erosion and loss of soil fertility and loss of wildlife habitat. That industrialization of agriculture exists both on the plant and animal side. And so I think it's unfair to characterize it as plants versus animals. So that, I said, is, I think, the superficial explanation for it. I think from a deeper look, from a more systems and holistic view, I think it speaks to our disconnection from the natural world. We are disconnected from the world around us, and that has led to ecological illiteracy. It has allowed broken feedback loops to exist, where we no longer feel the effects of degrading the landscape around us. We no longer notice when species go extinct around us because we are disconnected from it. And so if we were more integrated and connected into the natural world around us, we would see these things, we would feel them, we would notice them, and we would have a reverence for them, and we would care for them, and we would make decisions in a way that stewards the existence of those life forms, because deep down we would know that the existence of those life forms equates back to my own existence. And so I think from that deeper level, we are disconnected from the natural world. And because of that, it has broken the feedback loops that have kept us safe and healthy and allowing us to evolve all of this time. And that's a byproduct of that mechanistic thinking in the industrial world, which is just so prevalent all around us.
Gosh, I could just not agree more. And I think one of the symptoms of that is this championing of industrially produced plant-based meat as a better alternative to all meat, right? Not teasing out the nuance that exists within the livestock agriculture and all of the different ways that we can do that, and championing it in a way that it is better and better as a blanket statement for both planet and body.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And better implies that there's like good and bad in the world. And that gets back to putting labels on things. And I think rather than good and bad, looking at it more as more integrated with the truths of reality, like embodying the fullest extent of what is possible. You know, the fullest ecological expression of life is what we should all be searching for as individuals and as landscapes and as food systems. Like the fullest expression and embodiment of health is what we all need to yearn for. And if we went for that, that's going to look different for each person, and that will acknowledge the bio-individuality of each person's nutritional needs and social needs and desires and the needs of a landscape and a culture. But it allows for the expression of all that. So, you know, let's get back to the fullest expression of life that we can.
I would love for that to be the basis for the conversation that we're having in all of these realms, because I do think that everybody is coming from a place of good intention. And so I think that injection of embodying the fullest expression of life and health for every bio-individual organism, ecosystem, community, that should be the goal. And it requires us to really plumb the depths of nuance, of complexity, of ecological literacy. Yeah.
Well, and it starts with reconnection, or it requires that reconnection to place, to community, to self. And if people are going to truly reconnect with place and their self, they'll find that they feel healthier when they're eating a certain way that is more, you know, connected to the natural world and the fullest expression of that natural world. And if they are connected to that place, they will see the effects of their choices and how all of those things connect with one another. And when you see those things and you feel those things, you're going to make different decisions because you see them, you embody them, and you can't help but notice how your actions affect them.
I think that's beautiful. And I think it's just fostering that connection and helping to lead people back to that. And I think that Provenza has some really seminal studies for us to consider, that innate wisdom that those animals embody of being able to find what they need at a nutritional level to best sustain them so that they can fully embody their fullest expression of life and health, that we have that also, that is
those
still
animals
within us.
Are also us. Yeah,
yes,
absolutely. And he gives examples in the book. I think he gives an example of it
was a study that was done in the 1920s in an orphanage where
That's what it
they
was. It was an orphanage, and they gave the kids unfettered access to all different kinds of foods. And they didn't say, hey, you should eat this, you should eat that. Why don't you try eating more veggies? Or why don't you? It was just everything they could possibly imagine. And kids had free reign. And these were, children from like 0 to 10 years old or something like that. And they monitored every single thing they put in their body. And kids never ate the same thing. No two kids ate the same thing, and there were weird concoctions of a kid's like drinking orange juice and eating liver,
Yes.
and then eating marrow out of a bone, and then a banana, and like it's just all sorts of crazy stuff where you're like, really, you're putting those things together? But what they found was if a child had some sort of underlying disease or nutritional deficiency, they innately gravitated towards the foods that would fulfill that nutrient deficiency within them. And that was without any guidance from the outside world. And so that innate wisdom that exists within cows and exists within wildlife also exists within us, because just as they are part of nature, we are also part of nature. We all have this innate knowing, but it requires that true connection to what it is that we are eating. And there was something unique about that orphanage study where these kids had never been given any guidance on what food is good or what food is bad. They were just given the opportunity, and they gravitated towards the things that were best for them. And we have that within all of us. We are just, that innate wisdom is a little lost because of all the learnings that we've had from dietary guidelines or eating of processed foods in childhood that kind of formed our taste buds or affected our body in one way or another. It's still within us, but it's perhaps forgotten. And it is possible to get back to it. It just takes a little bit of work. And I think that's a beautiful thing because, when my wife was pregnant, she would gravitate towards some foods and, be repulsed by others. And rather than being like, well, babe, you need to get this, you want to get the nutrient density. I want you to get vitamin A, D, E, and K2. So let's get you some liver and let's get you just like, let's pay attention to what your body's saying. If your body is saying, man, I am just craving some oranges right now, maybe you need some vitamin C. And let's listen to that. Maybe there's something else in an orange that we have not yet discovered, but your body is missing it. Let's acknowledge that. Go for it. You don't need to understand exactly what it is, but honor that urge. I mean, obviously, if you're like, man, I could really go for a big bowl of ice cream, maybe try to interpret that of do you need cream? Is there something out of milk that you need? But also maybe have a bowl of ice cream. Fuck it. Who cares? You're growing a human, listen to your body and try to embrace that, because even if maybe that's a whack of sugar that you don't necessarily need, maybe you're getting something out of that the baby does need in its
and
growth.
Maybe joy is part of that.
Yeah.
Just enjoyment alone could be an aspect of that there is a more whole perspective of this. Yeah. Though I think that there is work that you often have to do to get over the hyperpalatability of modern foods and to sort of recalibrate your taste buds to enjoying some of these foods that we haven't eaten. I actually have a very good friend who is pregnant, and she was having some issues with fatigue, and we were sort of texting back and forth and talking about what she might be missing. And I mentioned oysters. And as soon as I mentioned it, she was like, nothing has ever sounded better than oysters right now. Yeah. And so I also think that there's this piece of it where our Rolodex of foods that are options, having many of us grown up on cereal and canned soup and different things, that we're not even always considering the smorgasbord that's available to us in terms of where we can get certain things. And sure enough, she went out, she got some oysters, and that was exactly what she needed. Yeah. That she needed that zinc, probably. She needed zinc, or she needed some of the copper, or she needed zinc and copper in that particular ratio. Or again, and I love that you said this, something that we're not aware of in those oysters, because there are more philosophies than you have ever dreamt of. Horatio is a quote I really love to butcher very poorly. My husband is Shakespeare. I am not. But there's more to these interactions of these foods within our bodies, within the bodies of our livestock, than we could consider.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And that's getting back to embracing the whole and, paying attention to those signals and, acknowledging that little person, just like acknowledging what comes up and being inquisitive about it and trying to pay attention to the signals that exist in the world around us and following them, whether that's intuition or gut feeling or, urges, and like just asking, what do these mean? What is this trying to tell me? How can I better show up for myself by listening to myself and, where I exist in this world?
I love that. I think that's perfect.
I feel like I have to take everything that we say and I have to wrap it up in the totality of a systems view. Like I hear myself saying it after every question and I'm like, you don't have to wrap it up at the end of every single answer, Bobby.
In some ways, I think it's a really interesting thing to do, though, because we are so unaccustomed to this way of looking at the world that for you and I to sort of be in this thought experiment where everything does get wrapped up into that greater philosophy, that greater foundation, however you want to categorize it, is an interesting thought experiment. And to put it in action for people that are listening to this podcast and are curious how they can themselves begin to think in this way.
Yeah, it's kind of like playing 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon, but with systems thinking. And so you're trying to, with whatever comes up in conversation, 6 degrees, systems thinking, everything's connected, and then that's what, Kevin Bacon equals systems thinking, I think is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, no, I think that's perfect. And it allows us, because I think this also speaks to humans' tendency to be more myopic, that we get stuck right here with what we see, with what we experience, and I think that this lends itself, this is part of the issue with some of our divisiveness and some of that lack of long-term thinking and being profit-driven solely, is this sort of myopia that we have troubles getting out of what we immediately know, see, and understand, and our modalities of thought that are readily available to us. And so it's that taking a deep breath and zooming out and gaining perspective. And there's a funny tie-in here, but humans want to see that panoramic horizon. They want to see that panoramic vista. It actually activates the parasympathetic nervous system, and that it transcends humans. Animals seek out areas where they can get a really big view in order to...
Well, it comes back to safety. It allows you a greater ability to assess the landscape of what threats might exist around you. If there is a predator that is coming and you're in a big, expansive area, you're going to see them coming from further away. And so just as we are drawn to fire, just as we are drawn to nutrient density, we are drawn to big, expansive landscapes. We're drawn to water features.
Yes.
Why do people have ponds in their backyard and water features? Like, we're drawn to water because water is also safety. Like, we need water. We need to cook at a fire. We need to stay warm at a fire. We need to see threats when they're coming to us. All of these things are, adaptive based on survival over the years and continue to be. And maybe we're not assessing if a lion is coming over the horizon in our direction, but, there still is something there that is part of our DNA. And maybe there's more to it than just assessing the safety of if predators are coming. Maybe there's something there that it allows for some sort of cascade of hormones in our body in terms of serotonin release that then allows for calmness and better decision making. Like, who knows? But there are so many different factors that could be at play. All we know is, if you're drawn to something, lean into it.
Yeah. Yeah. And seek that bigger perspective. Zoom out. Find it within your thought processes to see how everything is connected, or at least explore what you can see that's connected.
So you got to lean in and zoom out both at the same time. Yeah.
We've talked about so much, and I'm wondering if we've missed any major things. I mean, we haven't gotten deep into Savory, and
that's fine. There's plenty of, you can find the information out there wherever you want. I was really, I'm so glad we've had this conversation, because like these are, like this is a depth of conversation that I don't often get to have, but it fulfills me so much to be able to speak about these things and to ruminate on these things. But I just love looking at life from this angle, because it makes so much sense, and it gives permission to release control of having to understand every factor, and allows oneself the permission to just slow down and be and acknowledge the beauty of everything that's around us. And you realize all the good that can come from there. And so I am so grateful to you for, one, inviting me onto the podcast, but two, for asking me what book that I would recommend, because that then led to this entire conversation.
Yes.
Because Systems View of Life has been so formative for me, as has Holistic Management from Alan Savory, and the two of them in concert with one another, I think, are a beautiful pairing that goes from theory to practice and just explains so much about the world around us, and not just why things are the way they are, but gives a hopeful look ahead, because it shows that these systems are all interconnected, and these feedback loops, some of them are broken, and all hope is not lost. Perhaps we just need to reconnect, reestablish some of these feedback loops, whether it's reconnecting with place or self or community or whatever it may be. And if we can just recreate those feedback loops and get in proper relationship with one another and ourselves, I think there's a lot of hope for the future. And that's what I think I ultimately get out of all of this, is in a world where it seems all hope is lost, the system's view of life brings hope that there is a path forward, and that everything can be in service to life again. It just takes a little emphasis on a few different things.
A little shift in thinking, a little emphasis on some different things. I ask every guest this question, and I feel like you just answered it, which is, what does it mean for you to lay the groundwork for now, for generations to come?
I mean, I would say, understand your whole and find the fullest expression of that whole that you can, whether that's yourself, your community, your land, figure out your whole and express it to the best of your ability.
Oh, I love that. And this conversation really has given me so much hope, and it's let me explore some of the things that I've been ruminating on. And this book has given me a new lease on life. I know that this is going to form the foundation for much more reading to come, and much more exploration of how I build relationships in this world between myself and myself and others, and myself and my environment, and just the way that I see and look for relationships between these interconnected parts. And so I'm just so deeply grateful. And
well, it's the feeling is mutual. I've appreciated your friendship ever since that first time I walked into Western Daughters and was like, "Hey, I'm Bobby with the Savory Institute. I love what you guys are doing here. Let's talk. Let's be friends." And I love that you created a space that type of interaction was possible, and that for people with this common language and understanding of life can connect at this deep level. And I'm sad that I don't get to see you and Josh when I visit the shop anymore, but I'm grateful to connect from afar, and maybe I'll come out and visit sometime.
Oh, we would love that. And leaving the West cleaved my heart in two, and so we'll be back. I don't know when, but we'll be back when that's something that we can afford to do. And
Sure.
because farming was too important not to seize that now, that this is part of my fullest expression of life and of joy. But I'm so grateful that you came into the shop, and I hope this is the first of, I hope you will come back and join me on the podcast.
Absolutely. Okay. We've been going for 2 hours and 45 minutes. We'll make it a full 4 hours
we'll
next time.
Full 4 hours. We'll do a full thing. Where can people find you?
Well, you can find Savory Institute on most social media accounts. I'm on most social media platforms as well.
Great. We'll link to all
Bobby
those things.
Gill, it's spelled with a 0 in some contexts because there's a NASCAR driver named Bobby Gill who has taken most of the good social media handles, but whatever. You find the link in the show notes.
I'll find all of that. Thank you so much.